So we know in depth that Leviticus is full of allusions to the gospel and what Christ would eventually do for us. But Leviticus also, on a smaller scale, in fact, when reading on the surface, we see that Leviticus focuses on one task at hand that the Israelites were facing. Now, through all these laws and rituals, it can be difficult to keep track of what's going on in the story. But as the Bible Project puts it, the Bible is one unified story that leads to Jesus. And now we're going to explore and summarize what all's happening in this section of the story. So right before the book of Leviticus, in Exodus chapter 40, verse 35, Moses was not able to enter into the tent of the congregation because the cloud abode thereon, and the glory of God filled the tabernacle. So this was the problem, the task at hand. Moses couldn't enter in the tent because God's presence is so holy and just, and Moses and the rest of the Israelites being so sinful, they can't get near it without dying. Leviticus addresses that by symbolically doing what Christ would do, atoning for their sins. So, in the first 7 chapters, we see different types of animal sacrifices that the Israelites were to perform. 2 of them, the peace offerings and the grain offerings, 2 of these offerings were a way of saying thank you to God. The others, the sin offering, the burnt offering, and the guilt offering, these were a way of saying sorry to God. These animals were symbolically dying in the person's place, taking the punishment on itself. Chapters 8 through 10 is when we see that the priests are ordained. Aaron and his sons, these were the people that would minister unto God in the tabernacle. They were to perform the duties that the Israelites couldn't. They were appointed to represent Israel to God and God to Israel on behalf of the people. And we're given a reminder of how holy these people had to be, because in chapter 10, 2 of Aaron's sons waltz right into God's presence and defy and blaspheme God in the tabernacle, and God strikes them dead right there. See, because it's addressing the big issue, the ultimate issue again, is that sin and God cannot exist in the same person, because sin is the exact opposite of God's holiness. It's not that God's holiness is bad. It's just that it's like the sun. The sun is good, but it hurts us if we look at it too much. Or putting it a better way is, God's holiness is so strong that sin, being evil, it can't handle it. It gets destroyed. Chapters 11 through 15 are the laws on cleanness and uncleanness, and how one gets unclean or clean. Or a better way to put this is pure or impure. Now, it's important to remember that it was not a sin to be unclean or impure. In fact, it only lasted a few days, maybe a week or 2. Very rarely it lasted the rest of the person's life. That was mainly in the case of leprosy. And this was actually the invention of quarantine to keep uncleanness from spreading. And it's very relatable for what we're all going through now. And then finally, in chapters 16 and 17, we got the Day of Atonement. And this is the most clear. The most evident reference to Christ, is that one goat is sacrificed dying in our place for the sins of Israel, and then the priest confesses all their sins on another goat and casts it into the wilderness, removing our sin from us as far as east is from the west, just like what Christ was going to do. Now, for the rest of the book, the chapters here on out correspond to other chapters in the beginning of the book. Chapters 18 through 20 Chapters 18 through 20 correspond with the previous chapters, 11 through 15, on purity and impurity. Although these chapters focus more on Israel's moral purity, they were called to the highest moral standards. They were called to have sexual integrity, moral integrity. They weren't to associate themselves with sins. They weren't to commit sexual immorality. They weren't to sacrifice to other gods, because God is the only true God and the only God deserving of sacrifice and worship. And now you got chapters 21 through 22, again talking about the priests, similar to 8 and 10, only these are the qualifications for being a priest. A priest had to be part of the family of Aaron, or a Levite, and they were called to the highest standard of holiness because they represented God to the people, and they represented the people to God. They had to be as holy and perfect as possible, just how Christ is holy and perfect and can't get any more than that, because he represents God to us and us to God, constantly. He's constantly speaking on our behalf. He atoned for our sins once and for all. He was our final day of atonement. And then 23 through 25. Here we have them talking about the annual feasts that the Israelites were to observe and keep. And this corresponds with the first 7 chapters of Leviticus, the animal sacrifices, the ritual sacrifices. And by keeping these ritual feasts in 23 through 25, the Israelites would be constantly reminded what God was doing for them, and they were reminded of God's love and mercy. And then in 26, we get a review of the terms and conditions of the covenant and what will happen if Israel breaks the covenant. But God, being just, he won't turn his back completely on the Israelites, because he's a promise keeper even if we're not. And finally in 27, we're told the price that someone pays in money if they need to be freed from a promise or vow that they made to God on an individual level and didn't fulfill it. Now finally in the book of Numbers, in the first verse of chapter 1, "And the Lord spake unto Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tabernacle of the congregation." So the book of Leviticus, all these rituals and trying to keep the law, it worked in that it symbolically alluded to what Christ was going to do for us once and for all. The Israelites now were able to live near God's presence, similar to how we are able to live in God's presence every day thanks to Christ, because he atoned for our sins and removed it from us once and for all. And just because I referenced the Bible Project so much in this video, I will end this video by saying that is what the book of Leviticus is all about. Hope you guys enjoyed this series. I'll see you guys in the next video. God bless.